So good morning. Yeah, that was overpowering right there. Good morning. Like, wait, we can't talk in church. Wait, what? Okay. So all over China today, in the newspapers all throughout that country, there are going to be articles like this one appearing throughout the country. I think we got a picture of it. And each of these pictures are coupled with some writing in Chinese. If anyone would like to stand up and translate them, that'd be really helpful. But actually, I want to read the translation of this one. This particular article was published on June 13th of 2012 in the Awanhee newspaper, and this is the one that's circled in red. This is the translation. It says, "An abandoned baby, name unknown, was found in the Neihayun economical area of Tianqing City on March 17th, 2012. There was nothing left with her." So that's the identity of this child, and if you looked at the other articles to the right, they're all the same. So when a child in China is abandoned, they usually take the baby into the orphan care system, and then they publish an article in case maybe a parent accidentally lost the child, but they put it out there where parents or relatives that may recognize the child, didn't know the child had been abandoned, might come and reclaim the child. If no one responds, they just stay with the child care system. The Chinese government says there are 600,000 orphans in their orphan system throughout their country. But some human rights groups say that the number is closer to 1 million people. And according to UNICEF, there are 132 million children in this world that don't have a mom and dad. Now, I want to ask you two questions related to that. The first one is, how does that make you feel? I don't want you to respond. I just want you to think about that. That 132 million children have never met their mom or dad, or they do not know their mom or dad. 132 million. How does that make you feel? And the second question is, what are you going to do about it? Now, let's move on to something else. A recent article in Charisma News, it's a magazine, talked about the city of Houston, and I have a quote here I'd like to read for you. The I-10 corridor, so everybody knows what that is, right? I-10 cuts the city of Houston east and west, in the north and southern half. The I-10 corridor has been labeled as the #1 human trafficking corridor in the nation, Homeland Security agent Mike Booker said. Some hotspots look like spas, but they're actually brothels selling enslaved girls for sex. Ohad Shaul worked as a human trafficking bodyguard, and he said, I quote, "I wouldn't say the living conditions of a dog because your dog you take out once or twice a day. These girls get sold 10 times a day on a good day, and on a bad day they're sold for sex 20 or 30 times. The article then goes on to say there are an estimated 6,000 children on the streets of Houston on any given night, all of them runaways, and pimps take these kids and sell them for sex. So we have the most intense areas in the country, in our city, for child sex trafficking." Now I want to ask you two questions. The first one is, how does that make you feel? And the second question is, what are you going to do about it? Now let's leave the streets of China for a moment and the streets of Houston, and I want you to go into your doctor's office. So hypothetically, you've gone into your doctor, they've done some tests on you, you haven't been feeling real well lately, you've been short of breath, you've been having some dizzy spells, and so you go in, your doctor does all these tests, and the doctor sits down with you and your spouse, or just you, and says to you that you have 90% blockage on one of your arteries. And unless you change your lifestyle by eating healthy and exercising, you are going to eventually die of a heart attack. Now imagine being in that doctor's office for a moment, and I want to ask you the same two questions. How do you feel about that? And the second question is, what are you going to do about it? And why is there a difference? You see, we want to just pass over questions like the first few that I asked. And we say, man, there are 130 plus million kids without a family in this world. That's terrible. How awful that may seem. But I hope something gets done about it. And then we hear about right under our own noses on 1960 where there are brothels selling young girls for sex in our city within 20 miles of your house. So it's not in China, it's not in Africa, it's in Houston. And we hear those statistics, and we hear about children who are runaways, who didn't like their family or left an abusive home. They find themselves on the streets being sold for sex. And we hear of that and we say, man, that makes me feel terrible. That makes me feel awful. It makes me want to beat somebody up. But for most of us, to answer the question, what am I going to do about it? Let's just be real. The answer is probably nothing. We're just going to kind of get through this uncomfortable introduction to this sermon, hopefully, and get to something that make me smile a little bit more, you know? I need to come away encouraged. But why is there a difference between the way you would respond to that and the way you would respond to the news from your heart doctor that says to you, if you don't change, you're going to die? Why the difference? Why would everybody in this room leave that doctor's office and say, you know what, I got to throw out the potato chips, no more burgers and fries, I've got to eat healthy, and I got to start exercising? What's the difference? It's you. One impacts you directly, and one, it's just so much easier to kind of turn a blind eye to the brokenness all around you. And we could go on and on with stories, couldn't we? Not just sex trafficking. We could talk about addiction to substances, to drugs, or to alcohol. We could talk about people who are addicted to pornography. We could talk about people who are dealing and broken with depression. And we can show you all the statistics about in the Woodlands area, how many people, over 40%, struggle with some form of depression. And because we don't struggle with that same brokenness, we just kind of get glassy-eyed and say, man, it's terrible. I feel for them. I'll pray for them. But beyond that, I'm really not going to do that much different. There are broken people all around us. If you're a follower of Jesus, I want you to know something that you probably know, but you may not know. That at the end of the world, at the end of your life, there are two different judgments. One is a judgment where those who have not put their faith in Jesus stand before God. But then there's another judgment, the judgment seat of Christ, where if you're a believer in Jesus, you will stand before God and you will give an account of your life. And I think that for most Christians that I've been around, my dad was a pastor, I've been in church all my life. I think for most Christians, we have this idea of the Christian life that when we stand before Jesus and we're giving an account of our lives to God for what we've done, we think that it's going to be just one big game show of Bible Jeopardy. And we're going to try to impress God. We would say that when we stand before God, God's going to be really impressed with what we know about the church, what we know about the deity of Christ, what we know about the Bible being inerrant or without error in it. And we think that when we stand before God, God's going to ask us, now tell me what you knew about me. Well, God, I knew that you were eternal. I knew that you were never created. I knew that you existed, that you created all that was, that you're all powerful, you're all knowing. And God's going to say, well done, thou good and faithful servant. You knew more about me than someone else. Somehow in the Christian life, we miss something that in real life, every one of us lives every day. So let's say that you get up in the morning, so I apologize for the kind of crude example here, but you get up in the morning and you're walking around the house and you catch a scent. You smell something that's a little stinky. What are you going to do about it? Most of you are going to and look and see if it's you, right? Or you're going to go and see if it's you. And let's say that you take a whiff and you realize that you're the one that's stinky. What are you going to do about it? You're either going to take a bath or a shower, or you're going to put on some deodorant. Because we know that the deodorant in your drawer does nothing for you unless you apply it. And we know that in life. If your wall needs to be painted and you have a bucket of paint and you have paintbrushes, that paint in that bucket does no good for the wall until you what? You apply it. And it's the same thing with knowledge of God. You could know all that there is to know about the Bible, although I would question that you would be able to reach those depths because you can't mine deep enough to find the mind of God. You could know tons of information about what the Scriptures say, But if what you know about God is not applied to your life, my question is, what good is it in the drawer? You know, if you know that as followers of Christ, we are called to reach out to the broken of our community, and we do nothing about it, it's like leaving our information, what we know about God, in the drawer, and there'll be a day when we stand before God, and God's not going to ask you what you knew about Him. He's going to judge you based on what you did with what you knew about Him. And as my friend said one time, he said, make sure you bring some wieners and some marshmallows because there's going to be some roasting at the judgment seat of Christ. Think about it. If you stood before God today and gave an account of what you've done for your life, how many of you feel like that'd go really well? Or how many of you would say, man, I got to get my act together. I got to start doing some things. I want you to find Luke chapter 10 in your Bible. Jesus once told a story. And I think in the story, I want it to kind of serve as the springboard for the rest of this new series that we're starting today that we're calling Not So Random Acts of Kindness. We've heard of random acts of kindness where you pay for someone's dinner at Chick-fil-A just, in the moment, or someone does that for you, and it's great. But I think that kindness is not something that's random. I think that kindness is indicative that God is at work in your life, that the Holy Spirit is controlling more and more of your life. In Luke chapter 10, I want us to begin at verse 30. Jesus replied, so you're going to see there that he's replying to something that's been asked, which we'll get to in a minute. A man was going down from Jerusalem to Jericho, and he fell among robbers, who stripped him and beat him and departed, leaving him half dead. Now by chance, a priest was going down that road, and when he saw him, he passed by on the other side. So likewise a Levite, when he came to the place and saw him, passed by on the other side. But a Samaritan, as he journeyed, came to where he was, and when he saw him, he had what? Say it. Compassion. Now, how many of you have already seen yourself somewhere in this story? It's so easy for us to read stories like this in the Bible and say, man, I wonder who Jesus was talking about. He's talking about those Pharisees or those Sadducees, or he's talking about his disciples, and he's got something to teach them. No, the Word of God has something to teach all of us in this room today. Because there are 4 men in this story. The first man was a man whose life was ruined in a moment. He's going down the street, he falls among some thieves, they beat him up, they take everything he's got, and they leave him for dead. This is a severe beating. And maybe it was his fault, Maybe he should have known that if he went through that part of town, he was going to get messed up. Or maybe it was his fault. Maybe he had made some poor decisions along the way, and if he hadn't made those poor decisions, maybe he wouldn't have ended up in that position. These are all the things that we've said in our minds when we pass somebody on the street corner who's holding a sign asking for money for food. And maybe we would say, like some of these might have said, well, they're probably going to just use my help to buy something that they shouldn't be buying. And can't you read the article the next day about this guy? An abandoned man, name unknown, was seen on the road to Jericho, and nothing was left with him. Can't you just see that article? We don't know anything about him. We don't know his name. He's just abandoned. He's left there for dead. Nothing to his name. But what he needed was for someone to just help him. Someone to show some measure of kindness. And then there are 3 other guys. The priest, the Levite, and the Samaritan. Sounds like the beginning of a joke, doesn't it? Priest, Levite, and Samaritan were going into a bar, right? That's kind of the way that it sounds. 3 guys pass him. 2 of the men, the priest and the Levite, the scriptures tell us they passed by on the other side. But if you look at the verses describing them, it says that they saw him. They saw him, but they passed by on the other side. They saw him but thought, if I can just endure the rest of this sermon because it's not getting any better, I'll be able to just pass by on the other side and go to lunch today. But one man, a Samaritan, did something. Only one man showed kindness. And the question that I want you to wrestle with in your mind is, what was the difference? Why was it that only one of the three people did something? They actually did something to help someone else. Well, I think if you look and compare verses 31 and 33, I think you'll find the answer. Two men saw their encounter with this man as chance. Just by chance, they happened to walk by this man at this particular time, at this particular location. And by chance, they just walked by. It was a chance encounter, no divine interaction, just by chance they passed by this person in need at that moment. And you do it every day. You do it every week. How many people have you passed by on your street in need that you didn't even know about? How many times have you sat next to a classmate and you don't know whether or not that classmate is struggling with depression or suicidal thoughts? You didn't even know to care because you see everything in your life as just chance. You just kind of lucked into the house that you have now. You just lucked into that neighborhood. You got lucky and you just kind of had some good fortune that you found the job that you have. And you work with great people, and man, that's just fortunate. Most of us live our lives as though it's just big chance after chance after chance. Well, this is just kind of the way the universe did it. But one man saw the same guy, but rather than seeing it as mere chance, he was moved with compassion. So I want to tell you what kindness is. Kindness is living with compassion, not by chance. Kindness is living a life of compassion. It is not living a life by chance. Because I'm sure that the priest in the story that Jesus told, I'm sure he had a busy day. And maybe he was on the way to some important meeting. He had been serving in the temple all day long. I'm sure that he had places to go. And I'm sure the same was for the priest and the Levite. I'm sure that they had things that they needed to be doing. But if you look at the description of the Samaritan in verse 33, it's no different. It says the Samaritan, as he journeyed, he's not just out walking, he's going somewhere. He had things to do. We don't know exactly what they were. Maybe he had a kid's soccer game. And Wes Brown and I had a conversation about this, and I thought it was really, I think it's earth-shattering. Somebody defined for me off-season, like in sports. What's an off-season? It's the season of the year when you take off. Good, all right. Off-season is a break. So you play baseball in the season, but then during the off-season, you're off. But isn't it crazy how like all the kids' sports in off-season, you still play? You like play and practice all day, all year, every week. It's not an off-season. And he's like, imagine if you called into your work, hey, I'm going to take the day off today by coming into work. And my mind was blown. I just thought about it for days. So true. But maybe the Samaritan had to take his son or daughter to off-season soccer practice. Maybe he had to go home. Maybe he was going to visit family in another city. We don't know, but we know that the Samaritan had somewhere to go and somewhere to be. But he was moved with compassion. And compassion is the bridge between our awareness of people suffering and that person who is suffering being healed by Jesus. Compassion is the bridge between you understanding that orphans need families and you bringing an orphan into your family. Or you helping another family bring an orphan into their family. Compassion is the bridge between you being aware of human trafficking in your city and actually going and joining with a ministry that ministers to women who are slaves to sex. Compassion is the bridge between awareness of the need and bringing them to the healing embrace of Jesus. Whether or not the people of your street, the people who live on your streets, I want you to visualize those houses, visualize those apartments, visualize the people that you work with. Whether or not the healing embrace of Jesus is going to come into their lives will depend upon the depth of your compassion, not the number of chance encounters that you have with them. Whether your neighbors and family and coworkers are reached with the healing embrace of Jesus, that is the embrace that they need for their brokenness, will not be dependent on how many chance encounters, how many times you happen to sit by them in a class, how many times you happen to go to lunch with them in a group. It will be dependent on the depth of your compassion for that person. Because kindness is living with compassion, not living merely by chance. So if that's the case, the question I want to wrestle with for just a few more moments is, well, what is compassion then? And I want you to know right off the bat that compassion is more than feeling something. Because hopefully everybody would say yes to this. Don't you feel something for kids that don't have families? Don't you feel that? That's not all there is to compassion, though. Don't you feel for these girls in our city that are victims of sex trafficking? Don't you feel something for them? Don't you feel something for people in poverty? Don't you feel something for the homeless, especially now when it's going to get cold in the winter months and they're not going to have a place to stay? I mean, surely if you have Jesus in your heart, you have to feel something. But that's not all there is to compassion. Compassion goes beyond feeling, and compassion is really seeing people. In verse 33, you'll find it again. I want to read it. But a Samaritan, as he journeyed, came to where he was, and when he what? When he saw him, he had compassion. Now the saw there is not just seeing all of you. Think about it. I want you to look around this room. Everybody turn. Don't sit there. Look at all the different faces. Because most of you are just like, I'm not going to look. I'm not going to look. Many of you have been coming to Village Park for quite some time. But I want you to think about all these faces here, and I want you to really think about how many people in this room do you really know how they're struggling right now? Do you know what their struggles are? Are you the priest and Levite that rather than really seeing people, you just keep passing by on the other side? To have compassion for someone means that you have to really see them. It has to go beyond just the visual, but looking deeper at a person, at a soul. And this man saw a man in need and he was moved by it. Outside of this room on your street, how many people on your street or in your apartment complex do you really know what's going on in their life? I mean, how many times have you heard the noises, the screams of people fighting? And you know something's wrong in your neighbor or in the next apartment, but rather than do anything for that person out of kindness, you just kind of like, I just got to pass by on the other side because I don't know what I can do. Did you get lucky to find the house that you have? Or did God give you that house? Did you just strike good luck to have the job that you have? Or did God give you that job? You see, if you're going to live a life of kindness, if you're going to show people compassion, you have to live with compassion and see people. You have to see things not as chance encounters, but you have to understand that every part of our life is a divine appointment. It's God bless you with that job. God bless you with that house. God bless you with your family. God gave you the friends that you have. Indifference is what flows from a life lived by chance. You just go up to Walmart, and you're checking out, or Target, wherever you shop, and you're checking out, and you see the person that's checking you out, and they have this look in their eye, and you can tell they're hurting. And you just let them check you out, and then you go on your way with indifference. That's when we're living our lives by chance. But imagine the difference it would make if you, rather than seeing your life as just a series of random chances, saw them as divine appointments. That God put me in this aisle, number 15 at Walmart, at this hour with this person checking me out. And I may not be able to share the entire message of salvation, but I can give them something. I can give them what they need. I can share the kindness of Jesus with them. Because if you look around our city, it's not just in the brothels on 1960 and down by the Ship Channel where people are hurting. And people are half dead on your street. There are people half dead in the suburbs, they're in the urban areas, they're in Midtown, they're in Uptown, they're up here in the Woodlands. They're everywhere. They're broken, they're beaten, they're half dead, and without Jesus, they just lay there hurting. And what we have to do is we have to ask God, God, help me to see people with eyes of compassion. And then compassion means something else. It means going to the hurting. Look at verse 34. And he went to him. This man who saw the wounded, the Samaritan saw him. Verse 34 says, he went to him and bound up his wounds, pouring on oil and wine, then set him on his own animal and brought him to an inn and took care of him. When I was a kid, it was only when I was a kid, I used to watch Sesame Street. And there was this episode of Bert and Ernie that I'll never forget. And they're sitting in a boat, and Bert is frustrated because Ernie is catching all these fish. And the reason Ernie's catching all these fish, he doesn't even have a fishing pole. Ernie just stands there, sitting in the boat. Bert's got his line in the water. He's frustrated, can't catch a fish. And Ernie just goes, here, fishy, fishy, fishy. And a fish jumps out of the water and into the boat. And he just keeps doing it. And Bert is just steaming about it. I don't know how they made him blush as a puppet. Those puppets really do fascinate me, by the way. Like, I want to know where the people are and how many people are holding the sticks. It's crazy to me. Anyway, so, Bert is trying and trying. He's frustrated. Ernie's just calling him out, here, fishy, fishy, fishy. And they just keep jumping in the boat, landing in the boat. So Bert asks Ernie, how are you doing? And he said, you just got to call them, man. They'll come in. And so Bert's like, here, fishy, fishy, fishy. But you can tell he doesn't believe it. And nothing happens. Then Ernie does it, and another one jumps in, and Bert just keeps getting mad. So he gets really mad. And at the end, Bert goes, here, fishy, 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 gets frustrated, and a big whale jumps out and eats Bert. It's like the best thing ever. I just love that episode. But isn't that the mentality that most of us have about church? Right? Hey, Village Park meets at the Creekside Y. Here, fishy, fishy, fishy. And we just expect people to drive by here and see our flags and know that the healing embrace of Jesus is available to them. In order to reach the hurting, you can't have this mentality, I'm going to stand here, you come and I'll tell you. You have to be like the Samaritan. You have to go to where they are. We could say all day long, if you're out there and you're a victim of sexual abuse or sex trafficking, come to Village Park and we'll help you. And that message is never going to reach them. It takes us seeing people, but then going to where they are hurting. And then we also find in verse 34 that compassion requires sacrifice. He took his money, his oil, his wine, his bandages, and he paid for the inn. And the end of verse 34 says he took care of him. Then notice verse 35. And the next day, he took out 2 denarii and gave them to the innkeeper, saying, take care of him, and whatever more you spend, I will repay you when I come back. Remember what description was given of the Samaritan as he was journeying. He was going somewhere. But notice the timing of the story. He goes to where he was, he pours in the oil and wine, he bandages him up, puts him on his animal, takes him to the inn, and he stays with him that night. And the next day he gives money to the innkeeper and he says, whatever else it costs to take care of him, I'll pay for it. This is not a friend. This is not a family member. It's a complete stranger. And this man is giving of himself. He's sacrificing for the welfare of someone who's hurting. That may mean that you need to cut out your Starbucks for the next 3 months. Stop buying overpriced coffee every morning and take that money and put it in a jar and find someone who doesn't have a job or is out of work and give them money to go buy groceries for their family. It may mean that you got to sell something that you've been holding on to for years because you think those Michael Jordan cards are going to keep going up in value. I got a ton of them, and they ain't going up in value. Sell them and take that money and give it to a family who wants to buy a gift for their kid at Christmas. Give it to them. Let them have it. Compassion requires sacrifice. But I think the reason that most of us answer the question by saying, I'm really probably not going to do anything else, is because compassion requires you to love others more than you love yourself. Look at verse 36. Jesus told this story and he said, which of these 3 do you think proved to be a neighbor to the man who fell among the robbers? I mean, the answer is a no-brainer, right? I mean, it's the one who did something. And this was all an answer to a man who said, who am I to love? If you look at the verses before the story. And Jesus said, what does the Bible say? It says, love God and love your neighbor. And the man said, well, who's my neighbor? Because none of us have a problem saying we should all love God. But then when it comes to loving your neighbor as yourself, Loving your neighbor to the same degree that you love yourself. And as selfless as we like to think ourselves, we are very selfish people. We love me. And Jesus said, the greatest commandment is to love God and love people. And the man said, well, who's my neighbor that I'm to love? And if you look at the question, the comment that Luke makes is he was seeking to justify himself. The man was saying, yes, I know I'm supposed to love God and love my neighbor, but I've got a list of people that I think I shouldn't have to love. I shouldn't have to love people who don't get a job and live off the government because I have a certain political standing. Or I can love these people, but I'm not going to love this person because they're a different race. Or I'm going to love these people, but I have the right not to love this neighbor because they're a different social class than me, a socioeconomic class. So Jesus tells the story. A man fell among robbers, was beaten, left half dead, had nothing with him. 3 men came by, a priest and a Levite who passed by on the other side, and a Samaritan who gave all that he had for the welfare of that man. Now you tell me who's the neighbor. You tell me who loved his neighbor as himself. And the answer is clear. But notice this from Jesus is so powerful. He said, the one who showed him what? Mercy. And don't we all need mercy? We all need mercy. And kindness is mercy in action. It's compassion in action. And notice this, and Jesus said to him, you go and do likewise. Mic drop. For all of us. Stop trying to figure out who you have to love if you're a follower of Jesus and who you have the right not to love. Jesus says you go and you be ambassadors of mercy. Love the hurting and love the broken. If you want to know what it means to love God with all your heart and you love people with all your heart, you go to the hurting, you pour in the oil and wine, you bandage the wounds, you get blood on your shirt, you give them a ride, you stay with them, you pay their expenses, you counsel them, you listen to them till you're blue in the face listening, trying to give advice, and you be Jesus for them, knowing that they do not deserve mercy. And in doing that, you become the living embodiment of Romans 5:8. One of my life verses, but God shows His love for us in that while we were still sinners, Christ showed mercy to us. Christ died for us. Because in this story we see a spiritual representation of our lives, that our sin left us broken and bruised and bloodied and left for dead, separated from God. But Jesus on the cross poured in the oil and wine that we needed to bandage our wounds. And He paid everything that was necessary and some to pay for your sins and mine. And we have a right relationship with God. We are made whole. We are healed of our brokenness because of the sacrifice that Jesus made for us. So when we go out and we show kindness to others, we become the message of the gospel to the hurting world all around us. Jesus was aware of your condition, but He looked on you with compassion. And that compassion saw you for who you were. And rather than stand up in heaven and look at you in your fallen state and said, I told you you shouldn't have sinned, I told you the consequences, He came to where you were. The Bible says He emptied Himself and became a man, and He lived among us, and on the cross He paid the price. He sacrificed Himself for you. And kindness is living with that same compassion for people. I first became aware of the plight of orphans through my sister's story. My sister and brother-in-law were not able to have kids. Many of you know that story. And they began to tell us different things that they had learned about orphans, and I felt like probably many of you did. Man, it's terrible that a kid is raised without a family. I mean, goodness, I was so thankful for them and what they did to adopt Priya. And then they adopted Hope, and I was just blown away that they would give 2 kids a family. And my compassion grew for orphans. And so now, just a little over a month and a half ago, we traveled to China, and we picked up an orphan who is now our daughter, Eliana Joy, Ellie Joy. And some people have said, man, you're so lucky to have her. And my response is, it's not luck. It's just God. Because I promise you, when we signed up to adopt a kid, we had no idea who we would meet. We didn't even have a face. We didn't even, at that time, even know a country. But God placed a burden in our hearts, and now we look at it and we see how God brought us right to her life, and we walked right beside her. And now she lives with us, and she's our kid. And we love her with all of our hearts. And it requires daily sacrifice. I'm learning so much about kindness and compassion, especially to someone that doesn't understand even how to receive it. Every day God's teaching me more about the depths of His love for us. And I'm not saying, please don't misunderstand, that we're better than you because we adopted and you didn't. Please don't misunderstand that. Because adoption is not what God calls every person to. But kindness and compassion is. And God puts people and burdens in your life, and you got to stop seeing your life as random chance. You have to see them as divine opportunities for you to share the grace of Jesus with people. So who will you be to the man in Spring, Texas, whose life is being ravaged by alcohol? Let's just tell the story in our community. There was a man walking home from the bar who had given his entire life, adult life, to drinking alcohol. And he's lost his marriage, and he's lost his family. He's losing everything, and he's on the verge of losing his life. And on that chance occasion, a member of Village Park passed by him on the road. And what did he do? There's a couple in the Woodlands, Texas, and their marriage is falling apart. And one has walked to the other bedroom, and now they're sleeping in separate beds every night. They can't stand each other. They're trying to hold things together for the sake of the kids, but they're being held together by a thread. And a member of Village Park walked into the cubicle next to them the next morning. What do? There's a teenager in the Klein area who's battling depression and is writing poems that are dark and having suicidal thoughts. And a member of Village Park just happened to sit down next to this person in class because their last names began with the same letter. What are you going to do about it? A woman had an affair in Creekside Park, and her husband is dealing with unforgiveness, and a member of Village Park moved in next to them. A young person walked away from his faith, turned his back on God because of bad circumstances in his life. A Muslim moved in next door. A young lady ran away from home and was living on the streets of Houston, Texas. And a member of Village Park just happened to be placed in their path. My question is, how does that make you feel? And the second, what are you going to do about it? What I want us to do today is I want us to respond with prayer. And the prayer is very simple. And this is our emphasis as we begin this series on kindness. Is that God would open our eyes to begin to see people. And every day this week, I'm going to encourage you through email, through text messages, through phone calls, through Facebook. We're going to put a different prayer up this week. And what I'm asking you to do is to pray that God will begin this week to peel back the blinders from your eyes to see the brokenness all around you. That we'll begin to see people with the eyes of Christ. And then throughout this series, I'm going to be challenging you to do something about what you see. But this week, I want you to just ask God, God, open my eyes that I can see it. And not see it with politics in mind, not seeing it as an American citizen, but seeing it as a follower of Jesus. And then begin asking the question, now God, why have you placed me on this road at this time with this person? Show me where I can be kind and share compassion with them. So will you pray with me?